Good evening and welcome to another interview at News 9 Plus at the Raisina Dialogue. I'm joined today by a very interesting person, Dr. Ayoade Alakija, who's the co-chair of the African Union African Vaccine Delivery Alliance, Special Envoy and co-chair for Act Accelerator of the WHO. That's quite a mouthful, Dr. Alakija. Welcome.
Thank you. And it's a mouthful and it's quite an undertaking as well.
Right. Tell us about what you've been up to at the Raisina Dialogue.
Well, it's been an incredible, is it amazing? It's only about 24 hours so far and we still have, another 2 days to go. It's been wonderful to be a part of the opening and to listen to the fascinating conversations. Of course, geopolitics is dominating the scene with, this sort of dovetailing with the G20 foreign ministers meeting. And so having all the foreign ministers and of course with the global crisis and the Ukraine and the Russian foreign minister being in the room has been fascinating to, even just body language has been fascinating to watch. But this is not my first time here, so it's been great to reconnect with many people and to also see the way the world is shifting as we sort of begin to look at the other end of what COVID did to us as a world and begin to now look at the beginnings of the next crisis, because we have competing and clashing crises in this world of ours.
Right. How did Africa react to the crisis? I mean, how badly affected was it? Did you feel that sense of neglect of the entire African continent in COVID-19?
For sure. Africa, at the beginning of COVID, Africa Union at the time, which is all 55 sort of member states of the Union, which is, I say all the time and I joke with some of the Indian government officials that, well, you're 1.4 billion people and are 1.34 billion, because we're 1.34, we're very sort of similar in sort of scope and scale to India. But at the time, of course, we're different countries, not like India, and that's a whole nother conversation. But the president of South Africa was then the chair of the African Union at the beginning of COVID, and we were very fortunate to have that sort of leadership at the time, because he set up 3 pillars of the African response, continental response. And one was to deal with the sort of scientific testing and trials and genomic sequencing for the variants, etc., which we did an incredible job with, which is where, of course, Omicron variant was discovered about 2 years ago. The second one of those was looking at procurement, a sort of pooled procurement mechanism for purchasing vaccines, many of which were to be purchased actually from India, from the Serum Institute. And the third one was the Vaccine Delivery Alliance, which I now chair, then co-chaired with the former head of the African CDC. I now chair that, which was really very much more about the delivery, more about the making sure that all the countermeasures, not just vaccines, but diagnostics and also treatments got from ports to arms. And I sort of started the Ports to Arms initiative. But what we found was that the world left us behind, because unlike India, where you were manufacturing your own vaccines, which is a critical component of health security, we weren't. Africa only manufactures 1% of the vaccines that we use, and we use 25% of all the vaccines in the world. And so when push came to shove, the language and the rhetoric of no one is safe until all are safe got forgotten, and we were left behind.
Right. And how have things changed since the year 2019? We're in 2023. It's hard to believe it's almost 4 years. This is the 4th year since the outbreak. Have things changed dramatically since the pandemic?
Well, 2019, you said earlier, as you were saying, you said it's amazing that it's been almost 4 years. I feel like I've aged 20 years in the last 3 years, because the cry for equity, the cry for equitable access, the cry for the world to treat us all the same, as I often say that a life in New Delhi must be worth the same as a life in New York. And the world didn't do that. The world didn't consider us as equal. The world, would talk about the cost-value proposition of a life in Africa as though we were mere commodities. It commodified us, and it has played out in geopolitics. If we start to talk about geopolitics, I've recently publishing a paper in the Lancet, and it's played out there where countries are refusing to vote alongside their former allies because countries felt left behind. And I think the world is now beginning to see that health is not just health, but it is human security. It is a peace and security issue. And the way that we have not treated one another as equals, as real human beings within this crisis, the sense of, yes, nationalism is not a bad thing, but nationalism in a pandemic was suicidal, because the fact that high-income countries had purchased 10 times the number of vaccines that they needed, whilst other parts of the world had none, has perpetuated the pandemic. COVID, I posit, would have been over about 18 months ago. First of all, if we'd had decent global leadership. You know, the global leadership at the time in the US and in the UK was shocking. You know, they would typically take the lead in this sort of thing, but there is always a silver lining to every cloud, and what we have seen come up from that is that, you know, countries like yours, India, Africa, other places have stood up and said, well, you know, if these guys are going to like leave us to hang, we need to get up and we need to do our own thing. So that is the positive. But I mean, there are many spin-offs. I've called for a reimagining, not just of the global health architecture, but I've called for a reimagining of the entire post-1948 Bretton Woods institutions.
Right.
Because those institutions, multilateralism is not gone. We have to have multilateralism, but we have to reshape it. We have to relook at what were its incentives, what were the reasons for multilateralism. Those institutions were set up to rebuild Europe post-war.
Right.
And that was a very valid, and it was an honorable thing to do. But they were set up in the image and in the likeness of those who they were meant to rebuild.
Right.
They were set up looking like people from Europe and America. Now today, the problems in the world are not necessarily in Europe and America. There are more problems in Africa, in parts of Asia, and yet those institutions and their focus and their mindset is not leaning towards us. Their leadership is not leaning towards us. And therefore, you don't know what you don't know. They are unable to help us, or they're unable to align with us because they do not understand. They do not have the lived experience. They are not walking in our shoes. So until we, who are walking in those shoes, are able to be at the helm and are able to not only be at the decision-making table as a token, but are able to be equal partners, then no change will happen in this world.
It's interesting you should mention that, because our foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar, said something to that effect when he said that, you know, it's time we must understand Europe's problems are not the world's problems. He was talking in the context of war in Europe. And the fact is that, how do you see India's role in the pandemic in the last 4 years?
India did a great job in the pandemic. You know, every country will have critique and criticisms of their own leadership, but from the outside, and even in what was done with Vaccine Maitri, I mean, the other part of my life is from Fiji. My husband and daughter carry Fijian citizenship. We've lived there for many years, and I mean, Vaccine Maitri saved the islands of the Pacific. It saved Fiji, because when COVID first hit and when the Delta wave was creating such devastation here in India, I mean, we all saw those heartbreaking images of that literally burning through this country. What many people didn't realize was that the Fiji Islands also, they had a higher death rate than India per capita. But because, of course, it's a small country, you know, those of us who had friends and family there were 30, 40 people dying every day. In a small community, that meant that 2 or 3 of your friends and relatives were dying every day. But it was the fact that India sent 100,000 vaccines to Fiji that was able to help them quickly vaccinate enough of the most vulnerable to save lives. The COVAX scheme from the Act Accelerator, which I now co-chair, together with Carl Bildt, actually, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, who is also here, had sent Fiji 12,000 vials of vaccine.
1/10.
So Vaccine Maitri saved Fiji.
Right.
And so how did India do? I mean, I think, of course, India then shut down exports because the domestic pressures from the devastating wave here were significant. And we won't get into the dynamics of that. But the majority of the vaccines for COVID that were produced were in this country. up in Pune at the Serum Institute. You know, the government's vaccination program, which I spoke about earlier, the co-win with the using technology, which, you know, I was on this technology panel earlier. I must be, you know, my daughter was laughing because she said, you must be the least techie. You know, mother, you call me to order you food from Deliveroo from another part of the world. If I ever happen to be in London, I'll call my daughter and say, can you do the Deliveroo? I don't know what to do. But anyway, you know, but the tech panel, you know, I was talking about the use of technology to benefit people where they're at, to benefit communities. And the vaccination program in India is one that should be emulated. I very much believe that we need global South-South learnings.
Right.
We need South-South platforms. Africa and India, your 1.4 billion, my 1.34 billion. Right. We need to come together alongside one another and understand that we are more similar to each other than we are to who have our previous sort of traditional partners been.
Right.
And these are some of the things that I'm excited to see coming out of summits like this.
What are the other big learnings from Act Accelerator? It's about 2 years now since you were given Mission Act Accelerator.
Well, I'm Mission Africa and I'm also Mission Act Accelerator. The big learnings personally for me, it's been the honor of my life to be able to serve humanity in this way, to be able to sit at the table with the big boys, which is what I call them. They're 9 men, the principals of the global health agencies of the world that I chair a meeting of every single Thursday. And the heads of the Global Fund, the heads of WHO, the head of Gavi, the head of CEPI, the head of, I mean, it's an indictment on the world's leadership as well, that they're all men, and I make that point very strongly. But it's been a privilege to be in that space and to be able to make, I'm also the only person from the Global South. I mean, there's a head of WHO, who, Dr Tedros, but he's a citizen of the world. So I've come in as this, you know, iconoclast almost, you know, the wild girl who comes in and says, no, you can't say we're not going to be vaccinated. We're not doing that. And the learnings have been, we need a world where there's more of your voice and my voice at the table.
South.
Yes. We need a world where, because the people who head these institutions are largely male, Caucasian, from Europe or North America predominantly, they're not bad people. You know, the head of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, these are some of the men who are on the thing. They're not bad people, they mean well, but they don't understand our problems. You know, I have a saying, and culture is important and language is important. So I will say this in my language, that any bawabata, lumobitutin town, let's say, and that means that it is a person who wears the shoes, who understands where the shoe pinches.
Right.
And so if you don't have the people who are wearing the pinching shoes at the table, you're going to make shoes that are pointy on the wrong end and wide at the other end, because you don't get it. It's not that you're being wicked, you just don't understand. And this is what I mean about the post-1948 structures. This is what I mean about Bretton Woods and multilateralism. Multilateralism is great and we need it, but we must reform it. We must do it better. Those institutions must serve the majority of the world's population, and those institutions must consider women as equal partners at the table.
Wow. Dr. Alakija, what are the expectations from Africa and from the United States on India? I mean, where do you see India fit in the global South? How important a voice is the Indian voice in the global South?
India's voice is critical at the moment. We're seeing the geopolitical shifting sands. You know, I talk about the tectonic plates shifting in the world, and you know, even just as we just saw with the devastation in Syria and Turkey. You know, when tectonic plates shift and you have earthquakes, the flexible is what survives. That which is willing to bend, which is willing to move and shift along with the shifting of the plates is what survives. Those buildings that were rigid, that were structurally unsound, in many ways, whose foundations were flawed in themselves, those did not survive. And that is a moment we're in as a global community. The tectonic plates of this world that we live in are shifting. Power is changing hands. Power is literally shifting, and India is a big, major player in that. You know, your leadership, the voice at the moment, the G20 presidency is a crucial moment, even as we have this year with war in Ukraine, and we have that dominating the conversation. Yet still, I see the Indian government pushing. You know, there's the Troika, which is currently developing country in Indonesia, India, and then coming Brazil. And then the next Troika will be India, Brazil, and South Africa. So Africa is beginning to enter that conversation.
Right.
We have lessons to learn from India, because the way that you have managed to, over the last few years, you know, the sort of growth of the middle class and reduction in poverty is what we need to all look at. We need to, you know, not throw the baby away with the bathwater in many ways, you know, and that saying is, you know, everything has its good and its bad, but you have to look at what is good in it, and you have to learn from it. We have more to learn from Africa. We have more to learn from India, from parts of Asia, than we have to learn from the US, which has, in some poor parts of the US, worse maternal mortality statistics in parts of Africa. We have more to learn from India than we have to learn from Europe. We're more similar in culture, and we must embrace that. And I think as a global community, we have too often been snooty towards one another, you know, and you know, oh, those Africans, or oh, those Indians, or what have you. It is time that we all recognize that we live under this one sky. This, you know, what is the saying about, I love it, I can't say it in Hindi, the one family, one planet, one earth. You know, from your prime minister. I say we live under one sky, and we have to learn as a global community to do that more effectively together.
Dr. Alakija, thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking with you this evening.
Thank you.